In the autumn of 1940, as Europe trembled beneath the shadow of war, London stood on the edge of a night unlike any other. The world's greatest city, alive with centuries of history, music, footsteps, street lamps and laughter, was preparing to disappear into darkness. Every home, every shop front, every cathedral window, every bus, every train, even the great River Thames herself, were about to drown under a blanket of enforced night. This was the blackout. It began with a siren growing faintly over rooftops, a long, trembling cry warning Londoners that danger was not coming. It was already above them, the Luftwaffe bombers, trained to destroy entire cities from the sky, often navigated by moonlight or reflections from buildings. So Britain created a shield not made of steel, but of darkness. At 4:57 p.m., as dusk settled over the city, officials walked through the streets banging on doors, lights out, curtains drawn, not a spark. Mothers blew out candles. Fathers placed thick black cloth over windows. Children whispered under blankets, listening for the hum of enemy aircraft. Street lamps were switched off one by one until the familiar golden glow that had lit London's nights 4 generations vanished completely. Even car headlights were covered with narrow slits, so only a thin ray escaped. And then, London went silent. For the first time in hundreds of years, the city that never slept became a shadow. Buildings faded into silhouettes. Bridges vanished into the river fog. Big Ben stood like a dark giant, unable to reveal its face. The sound of footsteps echoed differently, as if the very air had changed shape. The blackout turned every street into a tunnel, every corner into mystery, every breath into a cautious whisper. But beneath the fear, something else lived in that darkness, the quiet courage of ordinary people. Air raid wardens patrolled with small torches, covered in blue lenses. They knocked on windows gently, saying, "Cover that gap. It can save lives tonight." Nurses walked to underground shelters with oil lamps pressed close to their chests. Families held hands tightly as they made their way into tube stations that had become temporary homes. Bunk beds lined the platforms. Blankets were shared. Children slept to the distant rumble of bombers overhead. Yet the blackout was more than safety. It was a strange, haunting world of silence. People remembered hearing the ticking of clocks louder than ever before. They remembered how the Thames looked when the moon's reflection was the only light on its surface. They remembered the strange beauty of constellations, once lost to the city's glow. And they remembered the unity. How strangers whispered, "Are you all right?" into the dark. How neighbors left food at each other's doors. How London breathed as one city, one heartbeat, one quiet defiance. Tonight, you will walk into that same darkness. You will feel the cold air of the Thames drifting between the blackout curtains. You will hear the distant hum of aircraft above a sleeping city. You will walk the lanes where street lamps once glowed, but now only memories shine. You will sit inside an underground station as the world trembles. Overhead, you will watch London hold its breath, not in surrender, but in fierce hope. This is not just a moment from war. It is a moment of humanity. Moment when millions of ordinary people turned off their lights to protect the lives of others. Moment when silence became a shield. A moment when the night itself became a witness to courage. Close your eyes. Let the darkness settle around you like it once settled around London. Let the quiet guide you back to a city that refused to break. Let the memory of that night carry you gently into sleep. This is the blackout of 1940, London's quietest evening, and one of its bravest. As September 1940 deepened over London, the city carried a tension that could be felt even in the stillness of early evening. People walked quickly through streets that had once been bright with pubs, shops, markets, and the glow of thousands of lamps. Now, as dusk approached, every Londoner knew one thing: the darkness was coming, and it would not be gentle. Earlier that summer, the air raid sirens had already become part of daily life. The Blitz had begun. German bombers had crossed the channel in waves, setting entire streets ablaze, turning homes to rubble. and sending families into the underground stations that served as their temporary shelters. But the blackout was different. This was not London reacting to danger. This was London preparing for it before it even arrived. At exactly the moment officials predicted sunset, wardens walked through the neighborhoods wearing metal helmets, marked with a simple W, their blue filtered. Torches flickered against the cobblestones as they reminded households of the rule that had become law. ***, no light, not a candle, not a crack in a curtain, not even a spark. ***, shops rushed to hang thick black cloth across their windows. Trams halted early so their interior lights wouldn't shine through. Drivers strapped metal hoods over headlights, leaving only a tiny slit of illumination. Even police wore white bands on their sleeves so they could be seen in the pitch-dark streets. London was transforming into something ancient, a city without light. Inside the homes, families prepared for night in ways that would become routine. Mothers carefully pinned heavy black curtains to keep even the faintest glow from escaping. Children were told to whisper and avoid touching windows. Fathers crouched by radios, listening to the BBC for updates on bomber formations reported heading south across the North Sea. And then it happened. As the sun dipped low, the entire city seemed to inhale at once. Street lamps flickered and then died. House windows darkened. The glow of shop rows disappeared one after another, like stars fading from a sky. The hum of London life softened. Within minutes, ***, a city of millions vanished into shadow. ***, the nighttime Londoners had always known, a city bright enough to erase the stars, had vanished. Big Ben did not shine. Westminster Abbey was nothing more than a silhouette. The River Thames gleamed faintly only where the moon broke through low clouds, and even that small shimmer felt like a risk. People stepped outside cautiously. Some grasped walls as they walked. Others used small torches aimed downward, their light barely enough to illuminate their own feet. A single lit cigarette could draw a warden's shout from half a block away. Every Londoner understood one stray light could help guide an enemy bomber toward homes, schools, hospitals. Yet in this fear, there was unity. A woman carrying bread to her elderly neighbor felt another hand reach out from the dark. "Let me guide you, love. Watch the step here." A man returning from work nearly stumbled into a warden who gently tapped his shoulder. "Easy now. Road's gone completely black around this corner." Even in darkness, London looked after London. When the distant drone of aircraft engines finally rose in the sky, the city reacted with a practiced calm. Families gathered their bundles, blankets, water, small treasured belongings, and made their way to the tube stations. Entire neighborhoods moved like rivers of shadows, flowing silently toward shelter. Children walked half asleep, leaning against their parents. Couples held hands tightly, guiding each other through the pitch-black streets. Inside the underground, platform floors were covered with blankets, suitcases, makeshift pillows. Those who arrived early claimed the deeper corners. Latecomers found spots near stairways, where the rumble of trains above vibrated faintly through the rails. Some read newspapers by the faint glow of shielded lamps. Others whispered stories to keep children calm. Nurses moved quietly, checking on the elderly. And above the ground, London stayed dark, silent, invisible. The blackout was more than strategy. It was survival. German pilots later admitted that the darkness made navigation nearly impossible. Landmarks vanished. Streets melted into shadow. London became a ghost city, protected not by weaponry, but by the disciplined silence of its people. Yet for all the fear, there was something strangely peaceful about the blackout. Without the usual glow, the night sky opened wide. Stars that Londoners had never seen before revealed themselves. Clusters of brilliance stretching across the heavens. People who dared step outside for air sometimes found themselves gazing upward in awe, their fear softened by the ancient comfort of constellations. On that first week of blackouts, diaries recorded moments like, "I could hear my own heartbeat in the street. The sky looked bigger than I'd ever seen it. The darkness felt like the whole city was holding its breath." Historical accounts agree. London was terrified, but London was brave. And as bombs fell in other parts of the city that night, the darkness protected countless lives, shielding neighborhoods that might otherwise have been illuminated targets. This was the beginning of a year in which light itself became a weapon, and darkness became a shield, a city learning to survive by disappearing. The deeper the autumn of 1940 fell upon London, the more the blackout became not just a rule, but a rhythm of life. Every evening followed the same pattern: a slow dimming, a quiet descent, a collective agreement that survival depended on silence and shadow. But while darkness protected the city from above, it also changed the lives of ordinary people in ways that history often forgets. By mid-September, Londoners could recognize the exact moment the city crossed into night. It was not simply when the sun disappeared, it was when the final street lamp went cold, leaving a sudden, breath-stealing emptiness where light had once lived. Moments earlier, the glow might still linger on a window pane or reflect on the damp cobblestones. But then, without warning, the last lamp died, and the world shifted. People described it in their diaries. It was like someone blew out the entire city. The dark felt thick, like you could touch it. I didn't know how black darkness could truly be. The darkness was so absolute that even familiar streets became unrecognizable. Men who had walked the same route home for 20 years found themselves taking wrong turns and bumping into fences. Women returning from work held their hands out in front of them, afraid of unseen curbs. Children clung to their parents with a fear that no one wanted to admit aloud. Accidents soared. Hundreds of people were injured every week by walking straight into lampposts they couldn't see. Cars crawled through the streets at walking speed because even a faint bulb behind a hooded headlight hardly helped. Drivers strained forward, their noses almost touching the windshield. Some attached white scarves to their antennae, so pedestrians could sense a moving presence. But for many, the hardest part was psychological. Light had always been a symbol of safety. Suddenly, darkness was safety, and light was danger. Inside homes, people whispered as if louder speech might escape through cracks. Kitchens were lit only by a single candle set deep inside a box, so the flame would not flicker outward. Mothers cooked meals by memory. Children read school books under blankets with tiny torches. They were warned never to point toward the window. Even hospitals followed the rules. Surgical rooms were shielded with thick curtains. Ambulances drove slowly with nearly invisible lights. Volunteers with bandages and first aid kits were trained to navigate by touch and instinct alone. Still, through all of this, London kept its character. In the darkness, neighbors learned to rely on one another in new ways. Wardens, ordinary men and women, many too old for military service, became guardians of the night. They walked up and down streets, tapping on windows. Mind the gap in your curtain. Lights leaking out from the corner, please cover it. Turn off that lamp. Love. Planes'll see it from miles away. Most households complied gratefully. They knew the wardens weren't there to scold. They were there to protect. But the blackout also revealed moments of unexpected beauty. When the city grew silent, people could hear sounds they had forgotten. The bell of a distant church, the slow murmur of the Thames, the soft wings of birds migrating overhead. On clear nights, some Londoners stepped out into their gardens, simply to look up at the stars. Countless pinpricks of light shimmering in a sky that had always been hidden by the brightness of the city. The Milky Way, unseen for generations, returned. Some wrote in their journals, "I had forgotten the sky was so vast. The stars made me feel small but strangely comforted. It was the first time I saw the heavens over London." But beneath this fragile beauty, fear always remained. On many nights, the distant rumble of engines announced the arrival of the Luftwaffe. The blackout could not silence that sound. It traveled like a warning through the cold air. Windows rattled, dogs whined, families froze in their kitchens, waiting to hear if the bombers would pass overhead or drop their payload. And always, they hoped the darkness would confuse the enemy. When the first bombs fell, The ground shook like thunder. Dust drifted from ceilings. Mothers pulled their children under tables or into shelters. Those who lived close to the docks or factories prayed harder, knowing those places were targets even in darkness. Above the city, German pilots struggled to navigate. Many reported later that London had simply vanished. The landmarks they depended on, the bright curve of the Thames, the glow of major streets, the silhouette of railway lines, were swallowed by shadow. And that was the heroism of the blackout. Millions of people choosing discomfort, fear, and darkness to protect one another. One warden wrote, "We are fighting with darkness, and somehow, darkness is winning for us." But for all its purpose, the blackout created moments of heartbreaking tragedy. People who lived alone often suffered the worst. Elderly men and women, too proud to ask for help, sat in cold rooms, lit by a single candle stub, their shadows trembling on the wall. Widows who had lost sons or husbands in France listened to the quiet and felt the weight of the world pressing around them. A few collapsed in the night, unable to call for assistance in the suffocating silence. Yet these too became stories of compassion. Neighbors began checking on one another every evening before drawing their curtains. Children delivered bread to older residents before sunset. People invited others to share warm rooms, warm food, warm company. The blackout was meant to protect London from bombs, but it also reminded London how to care for one another. As the nights deepened in September, one truth became clear. The darkness was not just outside. It lived in people's fears. And only unity, kindness, and quiet courage kept that darkness from taking over. London was learning how to survive night by night, with no light, no certainty, and no promise of safety, only the determination to endure. And this was only the beginning. As September moved into October 1940, the blackout no longer felt like a temporary measure. It had become a way of life, a system of survival that every Londoner, from dock worker to duchess, had embraced. And with each passing night, the darkness revealed stories that would never appear in newspapers, but would live forever in the memories of the people who endured them. By now, the rituals of the blackout were second nature. As soon as the last rays of daylight faded, curtains were pulled tightly across windows. Some families used carpets, coats, or even bed sheets when proper blackout cloth was too expensive. Wardens from the AAP air raid precautions walked their rounds with quiet discipline. They did not raise their voices unless absolutely necessary. In a world where noise carried too far, they spoke in low tones. "Cover that corner, please. There's a glow slipping through the top. Would you mind adjusting it? Thank you, love. You're keeping us all safe." Ordinary people became protectors of the whole city, and every Londoner understood their responsibility. ***, a single beam of light could guide a bomber. A single candle could cost a street. ***. But while the darkness protected the city, it also created a strange, dreamlike atmosphere that London had never known before. In the deep night, the city became unrecognizable. Church spires turned into black arrows pointing at the sky. Chimneys vanished into the fog. Bridges seemed to disappear halfway across the Thames. Even the river itself, usually sparkling under lamplight, became a vast, silent void. Sometimes, on clouded nights, people said it felt like the entire city had fallen out of the world. Inside, families tried to continue life as normally as they could. Meals were simple and eaten early. Children worked on their homework using shielded lamps. Some parents read aloud from old novels, their voices quiet but steady, trying to distract little minds from the distant rumble they knew too well. But for others, the blackout brought a heaviness that words could not ease. Many Londoners struggled with the psychological weight of constant darkness. Teachers noticed children growing more anxious. Workers stumbled home exhausted, their nerves worn down by sleepless nights in shelters. Letters written during the period described the same aching reality. "I haven't seen my own shadow in weeks. I dream of light the way one dreams of warmth in winter. You can lose yourself in this darkness if you're not careful." Still, humanity refused to fade. In some neighborhoods, People opened their doors to invite neighbors to gather before the sirens began. Someone brought tea. Someone else brought a loaf of bread. Conversations were whispered, but laughter still found its way into the dim rooms. It was in these fragile moments that London's heart beat the strongest. But outside, above ground, another battle raged. Navigating London during the blackout was dangerous. Cars collided. Pedestrians tripped and fell into canals or off curbs. Cyclists rode with tiny, barely visible lamps that often failed in the damp air. Police guided late-night workers home by voice alone. Step left. There's a crossing here. Mind the bend. Fog's thick tonight. Yet despite these dangers, the streets were never empty. Essential workers still moved through them. Nurses heading to hospitals, firefighters racing to stations, factory laborers beginning their night shifts to support the war effort. Even milkmen made their rounds before dawn, tapping quietly on doors to leave bottles wrapped in cloth to avoid the sound of glass above them. The sky was changing. During the blackout, the stars returned, not faint, hesitant glimmers, but bright constellations stretching across the heavens. Sailors and pilots often said the night looked alive in ways they had never seen. People wrote to relatives in the countryside. London has finally become part of the sky again. In the underground shelters, life took on its own rhythm. Thousands slept side by side, forming an unofficial nighttime community. Mothers rocked babies to sleep. Factory workers played cards by shielded lanterns. Children drew pictures on old newspapers using bits of charcoal. Musicians sometimes brought violins, their soft melodies echoing faintly along the tiled walls. It was not comfort, but it was survival. And always, the tension hovered. Asterisk. When would the sirens begin? Would tonight be one of the terrible nights? Would the darkness save them? Or would flames find them anyway? Asterisk. On many evenings, people stepped outside shelters to listen. Sometimes, the city seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the distant murmur of the river. Then came the engines, faint at first, then growing louder. Every Londoner knew that sound. The rhythmic hum of German bombers flying in formation. Eyes widened. Hands tightened around children's shoulders. Radios were turned down. And always, they repeated the quiet hope. Let them miss the city. Let the darkness hide us. Let them pass. The first bombs often fell miles away. The docks, the warehouses, the factories near the river. But as the nights grew colder and the raids grew heavier, the sound came closer. Windows shook. Dust fell from ceiling beams. The ground trembled like a heartbeat felt beneath one's feet. Fire crews, trained to navigate the dark with astonishing speed, rushed toward the impact sites with shields, hoses, and helmets glinting faintly in the moonlight. They battled flames that rose higher than buildings, feeding on dry timber and gas lines. And yet, every single night, the blackout saved lives. German pilots often mistook parks for the river or dropped bombs in empty fields. Factories they thought they had hit remained untouched. Residential streets vanished into shadow. London became a phantom city, impossible to map from the sky. But the blackout had a cost. People began losing track of time. Without street lamps, without the glow of windows, without the comfort of nighttime familiarity, the hours blended. Some said they felt like they were living underground even when they were outside. Others dreamed of daylight the way the thirsty dream of water. Still, they endured. One historian later wrote, London fought the war, only with soldiers and fire brigades, but with blackout curtains. It was true. Millions of small acts, curtains pinned tight, candles extinguished, lamps shielded, helped shield the city from destruction. And as October approached, the blackouts would soon reveal moments of both heartbreaking tragedy and breathtaking courage. London had entered its darkest season, but also its most united one. By early October 1940, the blackout had woven itself so deeply into London life that the city no longer remembered what it felt like to move freely after sunset. The days seemed shorter, the nights endless, and the people, though determined, carried exhaustion like a second shadow. Yet even as fatigue settled into every home, the courage of Londoners only grew stronger. Every evening, just before the last traces of daylight vanished, the final preparations began. Wardens walked their neighborhoods with quiet steadiness, making sure every curtain was pulled tight. It didn't matter if the house belonged to a wealthy banker in Kensington or a dockworker in Limehouse. The rule was the same for all. London was united by darkness. Families learned to read the sky as sailors once had. They could sense when the air felt charged, when clouds drifted too quickly, when the horizon turned a strange shade of grey. These were signs that a raid might come. On such nights, people moved more quickly, speaking in hurried whispers as they gathered blankets, food, water, radios, and photographs. Some carried letters from loved ones far from home, voices on paper that brought comfort during the longest hours inside shelters. The atmosphere was a mixture of fear, fatigue, and an unexpected warmth. Tube stations were lined with rows of bunk beds, hammocks, and sleeping mats. The London Transport Museum still keeps photographs from that time. Children curled up beside mothers, men reading newspapers by dim lantern light, women knitting sweaters for soldiers, while bombs shook dust from the ceiling above. These shelters became their own small worlds. A teacher read stories to children in soft tones, trying to drown out the rumbling of aircraft overhead. A man played harmonica on calmer nights, his quiet notes echoing against tiled walls. A nurse moved between families, checking on the elderly and comforting the anxious. Even pets found refuge there. Cats curled on blankets, dogs resting at their owners' feet, tails thumping softly when recognized by familiar hands. But despite these fragile moments of comfort, the blackout demanded discipline. Above ground, fire brigades worked tirelessly. They navigated streets illuminated only by moonlight, feeling their way toward fires. Their carts rattled over cobblestones, axes and hoses clanging, as they rushed to save homes, factories, and lives. They would often return exhausted, clothes covered in ash, eyes burning from smoke, only to prepare for the next night's battle. Ambulances drove slowly, headlights covered with metal slits, their sirens muffled to avoid guiding enemy planes. Drivers had to memorize the streets. There was no map that could help them now. Many times, they transported injured civilians whose only mistake had been attempting to navigate the night. But perhaps the most haunting part of the blackout was the silence between sirens. London, a city known for its roar, became quieter than any countryside village. People said they could hear the distant creak of ships on the river. Others claimed they could hear the flutter of pigeons' wings as they settled on rooftops. The ringing of distant church bells carried across neighborhoods that never heard each other before the war. There was a strange intimacy in this quiet, as if every Londoner shared the same single breath. Yet beneath this calm, fear never left. Every night around 9 or 10 p.m., people waited for the sound that defined the era. Sometimes it came suddenly, like a blade slicing the silence. Sometimes it approached slowly, a distant hum growing louder until it filled the sky. The sound of Luftwaffe bombers. Londoners knew the pattern well. A low, rhythmic drone. The trembling of windows. The faint vibration beneath their feet. Some prayed, some held their children tighter, some stared upward, unable to see anything through the dark sky, but knowing death approached. When bombs fell, the earth itself seemed to lurch. Explosions created flashes of orange that briefly illuminated the clouds before vanishing back into blackness. Fire brigades raced toward the glow. Wardens shouted warnings. Neighbors helped neighbors down stairwells, over rubble, into shelters. What amazed historians later was not just how London survived these nights, but how Londoners refused to abandon one another. There were countless stories that never made it into documentaries or textbooks. Young woman who refused to leave her elderly neighbor alone and guided her through collapsing streets. A man who shielded to children in a doorway when a building exploded nearby. A nurse who saved lives with nothing but a candle, a blanket, and her steady hands. And through all of this, the blackout remained their shield. German pilots struggled to find their targets. The docks, the industrial districts, the railway yards, all vanished under darkness. Many bombs fell harmlessly in fields or parks. The city's heartbeat continued because its people had learned to extinguish every glimmer of light. Yet, the blackout had unexpected consequences as well. Many Londoners grew aware of the emotional toll, the loneliness, the restlessness, the dreamlike disorientation of never seeing the night in its natural form. People missed the golden glow of lamplight. They missed seeing the familiar outlines of buildings. They missed watching shop windows sparkle on rainy evenings. Still, when asked whether they wanted to end the blackout, even temporarily, most replied the same way. It keeps us alive. They were right. One intelligence report from the time noted, when the city disappears, so too does our enemy's ability to navigate. And so, despite fatigue, despite fear, despite accidents and confusion, the blackout continued every night, every hour, every breath. As October progressed, London reached a moment that would test its courage even more fiercely than before. The raids would increase, the nights would grow colder, the shelters would become more crowded, the fires would burn longer. But the city that had chosen darkness as its shield would not break. Not yet. Not ever. The darkest month of the year had only begun. By the middle of October 1940, the blackout was no longer simply a nightly ritual. It was the very heartbeat of London. The city had become a place of shadows and whispers, where courage lived quietly inside ordinary people, and where every night felt like walking through history while the world trembled above. The Blitz was now at its fiercest stage. The raids grew heavier, the bombs larger, and the silence between attacks grew thinner each day. Yet London endured. As the sun disappeared earlier each evening, people rushed to finish their tasks before the darkness swallowed the streets. Shopkeepers served customers by candlelight filtered through boxes. Bus conductors wore white gloves so passengers could see their hand signals. Men walking home tied white handkerchiefs to their jackets so drivers could spot them in the gloom. Every detail of life adapted to the blackout, as if the entire city had learned to breathe differently. But it was the emotional landscape of the people that changed most. Many Londoners kept diaries that historians still study today. In them, they describe how strange it felt to live in a world where darkness had become an ally. They wrote of the way the city seemed to shrink into itself, how the boundaries of each street blurred, how familiar landmarks vanished, how people recognized neighbors only by their voices. And yet, in all this fear and isolation, they also wrote about moments of unexpected closeness and compassion. One man described the silence of Trafalgar Square during a blackout as the quietest place in the world, a strange contrast to its usual crowds. Another wrote of being lost on his way home because he couldn't see more than a foot ahead, until a stranger guided him by the arm the rest of the way. A woman wrote of hearing a lullaby sung by a mother to her child in a shelter, the sound more comforting than any light. But as peaceful as these moments were, the raids continued with increasing brutality almost every night. The Luftwaffe sent wave after wave of bombers. Historian Richard Collier later recorded how the sound of engines approaching was like a swarm of angry bees sweeping across the night. Londoners said they could feel the vibration in their bones. Long before the first explosion hit. When the bombs fell, they tore through buildings with terrifying force. Streets were reduced to rubble within minutes. Fires roared high enough to turn clouds orange. Even when the blackout hid everything else, fire brigades, wearing helmets that gleamed faintly in the darkness, rushed into burning ruins with axes and hoses. Their bravery became legendary. One famous incident took place in mid-October, when thousands of incendiary bombs fell in a matter of minutes. They burst on rooftops all across the city, creating hundreds of fires. Firefighters described the scene as a rain of flame. But even under such conditions, wardens and volunteers climbed ladders with sandbags, beating out flames on rooftops that could collapse beneath them at any moment. This was the other side of the blackout. a world hidden from sight, but burning fiercely in sound and heat. Inside shelters, families felt the earth shake, dust drifted from ceilings, babies cried, young men tried to stay calm, while fear pulled at their nerves. People whispered prayers, a few told stories, or hummed songs to drown out the terrifying echoes. Yet even during the heaviest bombings, courage appeared in ways no one expected. A woman named Barbara Moore helped lead strangers to safety in pitch darkness after a building near her home collapsed. A firefighter named Jack Cornwell rescued a family from their cellar moments before flames consumed it. A nurse held the hands of the injured while the hospital trembled under each explosion, offering comfort even when she herself was exhausted. Acts like these were not rare. They were nightly. And the blackout was always there, a silent guardian. Without it, the destruction would have been far worse. German bomber crews later admitted that finding targets during the blackout was nearly impossible. Streets disappeared, rivers vanished, landmarks they had memorized from maps were nowhere to be seen. Sometimes, entire formations of planes dropped bombs miles away from their targets, confused by the endless darkness below. Still, the blackout came with heavy emotional and physical prices. People struggled to sleep. Their dreams were filled with trembling glass, distant sirens, and falling bombs. Many woke up disoriented, unsure if it was morning or still night. Others found themselves startled awake by silence, their minds waiting for the next siren that might or might not come. Doctors noted rising stress, anxiety, and exhaustion among all ages. Children grew fearful of the dark. Adults found themselves afraid to walk alone after sunset. Even pets behaved differently. Dogs barked nervously, cats became uneasy, and birds migrated differently due to the lack of light. But despite all this, London held its ground. One of the most remarkable examples of unity came in the markets near Aldgate. Vendors still opened their stalls at dawn, offering whatever food they could find: bread, fruit, scrap pieces of meat. Women lined up quietly, exchanging news in soft voices. The docks were hit again. They say St. Paul's is still standing. Have you heard from your son? Life went on, gently, bravely, stubbornly. The blackout had become more than just a rule of war. It was a symbol of endurance, a symbol of unity, a symbol of a city refusing to surrender. And as October continued, the nights grew colder, the bombs heavier, and the darkness even more important. London was entering the most dangerous stretch of the Blitz, and the blackout would be the thin veil standing between the city and complete devastation. The courage of millions, wrapped each night in shadow, would soon be tested even further. Late October 1940 arrived with a cold that crept into every corner of London, the kind of chill that settled into bones, lungs, and thoughts. The nights grew longer, the sunsets earlier, and the blackout darker than ever. Even those who had grown used to living without light felt the shift. The air felt heavier, the streets felt quieter, and the bombs, they felt closer. Londoners had now lived nearly 2 months in this unnatural routine. Darkness, sirens, shelter, shaking earth, smoke, exhaustion. The city moved through these motions with the precision of survival. But beneath this routine lay a deeper truth. The people were tired, yet, somehow, they were stronger than before. The blackout was strict, but London had become even stricter with itself. No cracks in curtains were tolerated. Wardens checked windows with greater urgency. People whispered more softly. It felt like the entire city had learned to hold its breath. But the darkness was not uniform. Some nights were so foggy that people couldn't see their own hands. Other nights were crystal clear, the moon lighting rooftops like silver. On those nights, the fear grew stronger because moonlight made everything more visible from the sky. One warden recorded in his diary, "The brighter the moon, the deeper the dread." On moonlit nights, streets fell into a strange grey stillness. Buildings seemed to lean into the shadows. The sound of boots echoed farther. Even quiet conversations seemed louder than they should have been. And always, above it all, The hum of warplanes drifted like a ghost across the sky. Yet life refused to stop. During the day, Londoners repaired damage as best they could. Volunteers cleared rubble from roads. Workers patched holes in roofs using scrapwood. Women washed soot-stained clothes from buckets in backyards. Children, unbelievably, still played in alleys. Their laughter the only sound that reminded the world that life still existed. But as sunlight faded, everything changed again. The ritual began. Curtains drawn, doors locked, candles shielded, street lamps killed, shops shut early. Cars covered. And then the city disappeared. One historian wrote, "For those who lived through the blackout, London did not fade into night. It simply ceased to exist." Inside homes, people found new ways to adapt. Some used heavy blankets as blackout covers. Others taped newspapers to windows. Those who had sewing skills stitched thick fabrics into makeshift light blockers. Entire families worked together to keep their homes invisible from the sky. In the underground shelters, the same rhythm continued. People slept, ate, and waited together. During quiet hours, volunteers walked between platforms handing out tea, biscuits, and encouragement. Families whispered stories of better days. Children asked questions they didn't fully understand. Why did they bomb us? Will the lights ever come back? Can the stars see us in the dark? Parents answered with courage they did not always feel outside. However, the destruction continued. Some nights, it seemed like the entire East End burned. Warehouses exploded. Factories collapsed. Streets were left looking like skeletons. Twisted metal, shattered brick, and smoke rising from broken homes. And yet, through all this, London clung to hope. One of the most remarkable stories of the period occurred near St. Paul's Cathedral. A team of volunteer firefighters stayed on the cathedral roof every night, extinguishing incendiary bombs before they could ignite the Great Dome. They worked silently, knowing that, if the cathedral fell, the city's spirit might collapse with it. One of them later said, "While the city hid in darkness, St. Paul's stood like a ghost of courage. The blackout saved it many times." German pilots, deprived of familiar landmarks, often flew too high or too far. They misjudged distances. They dropped bombs where they thought the city should be, not knowing the darkness had tricked them. But despite this protection, the blackout did something more profound. It changed the way Londoners saw each other. In the dark, class distinctions blurred. Banker and a factory worker shared the same bunk. Wealthy woman held the hand of a stranger's child. Street sweeper comforted an elderly man too scared to sleep. A nurse sang softly to calm a group of trembling children. War erased the boundaries that society had drawn. People realized that courage is easier in daylight, but true bravery is born in darkness. As October pushed on, London faced some of its worst raids. Incendiary bombs rained down like burning hail. High explosive bombs carved deep wounds into the earth. Firefighters worked until their hands blistered. Doctors refused to leave their posts even when buildings shook. Wardens kept patrolling even as glass shattered around them. And ordinary people, they endured. One woman, interviewed decades later, said, "It wasn't the bombs that broke us. It was the waiting, the silence, the darkness, the not knowing. But somehow, we survived it together. Every night, people wrote letters in dim light. We are alive. The darkness saved us again. Tomorrow, we will rebuild." Even when streets lay in ruins, Londoners swept their doorsteps in the morning. A small gesture of defiance. A quiet promise to themselves and the world. **, we will not fall. **, by the end of October, people realized something quietly extraordinary. Despite the terror, despite the destruction, despite the endless nights, the blackout had worked. The city still stood. Families still held each other close. Lights remained off, but hope remained alive. The sky trembled with war, but the people did not break. London had become a fortress made of shadows, courage, and unshakable unity, and November would soon arrive, bringing even darker nights, even heavier bombs, and moments of unimaginable sacrifice, but also the clearest proof: a city wrapped in darkness could still shine brighter than any flame. By the first week of November 1940, the Blitz had reached a level of intensity that even seasoned wardens and firefighters struggled to describe. The nights felt longer, the cold sharper, the bombers louder, the explosions deeper, and yet, through it all, the blackout remained the first and most unbreakable line of defense. London, silent, disciplined, invisible, continued its nightly transformation into a city of shadows that refused to be destroyed. The sun now set before most people returned from work. Office clerks emerged from buildings into streets, already fading into darkness. Dock workers hurried to finish shifts as fog rolled in from the Thames. Women leaving factories clenched their coats tightly, their footsteps quick and cautious as they crossed streets lit only by the faint moon. Londoners walked by instinct, not sight. Drivers crawled slowly, gripping their steering wheels, peering through narrow slits in covered headlights. Buses ran at reduced speeds, their interiors dimmed until passengers could barely see the person beside them. Policemen began carrying white batons that glowed faintly so pedestrians could follow them through intersections. But even as the nights grew more dangerous, the people grew more united. Neighbors walked home together, linking arms so none would trip on unseen curbs. Mothers carried torches aimed downward, illuminating only their children's shoes. Factory whistles signaled the end of shifts earlier, afraid that workers might not make it home safely in the deepening fog. The fog itself became a character in London's wartime story. It crept low across the river and drifted into narrow lanes, swallowing entire streets. In the blackout, fog turned the city into a maze. People described it as a blindness made of smoke. Yet even this fog helped the city. German pilots reported that when fog mixed with the blackout, London disappeared completely. They saw nothing but a vast blanket of darkness, with occasional fires burning like distant candles. Many returned to base having missed their targets entirely. But while the fog protected London from above, it made life below even more dangerous. Accidents multiplied. People walked into lampposts and canal edges. Drivers struck unseen debris left from previous bombings. Children, especially, had to be watched constantly. Parents whispered warnings: "Stay close, hold my hand, don't run." Not in this dark. Some nights, families avoided going outside altogether. They sat together around shielded candles, sharing stories, gripping each other's hands when the ground trembled under distant explosions. Inside the underground shelters, life continued as if in another world. The platforms were packed every night now. Families claimed spots with blankets and crates. Volunteers brought warm drinks when they could. Men played chess with sets carved from scrapwood. Children performed small show songs, poems, dances to distract themselves from the rumble above. One shelter worker wrote, "In the tube, we became a single family, thousands of us breathing the same air, sharing the same fears, waiting together in that slow, endless night." Sometimes, when the all-clear siren sounded after hours of terror, the crowd would clap softly, not out of joy, but out of relief. They survived another night. But outside the shelters, the destruction intensified. Warehouses along the docks burned 4 nights at a time. Firefighters worked in shifts, moving like silhouettes against walls of flame. They climbed collapsing buildings, carried hoses up shattered staircases, and leapt over burning debris. Many worked until their uniforms smoldered and their lungs filled with smoke. Their courage became the pulse of the city. Block wardens patrolled even during bombings, risking their lives to check on people trapped in cellars. Ambulances rattled through rubble with nearly invisible headlights. Nurses treated injuries by the light of oil lamps hidden behind blankets. Yet the blackout still did its job. Even during the heaviest raids, large portions of the city remained untouched simply because bombers couldn't see them. The darkness acted as a shield, silent, powerful, and absolute. Still, November brought personal heartbreaks that Londoners would carry for decades. Entire households wiped out, fathers lost returning from fire duty, mothers holding Children under collapsed ceilings, letters, delivered to homes no longer standing. Yet even in grief, the city did not crumble. Church bells continued to ring in the mornings, their chimes drifting over streets still smelling of smoke. Cafes reopened, offering small meals. Women swept the rubble from their front steps at dawn, an act historians later called London's quiet resistance. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of the blackout's effect came from the sky itself. Because with the lights gone, Londoners began seeing the stars again, truly seeing them. Diaries describe Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. One woman wrote, "I had forgotten the sky was so beautiful. It was like a gift in the middle of all this sadness. For a moment, the city remembered wonder. But the blackout required more than discipline. It required sacrifice. Businesses suffered. Theaters closed early. Evening life vanished. People stayed inside, not because they wanted to, but because the city needed them to. And every night, the same cycle continued. Darkness. Sirens. Explosion. Silence. Shaking floors. Deep breaths. Clutching hands. Whispered prayers. Waiting. Enduring. London lived inside that rhythm. Yet no matter how many bombs fell, no matter how heavy the night, people kept going. A woman who survived one of the worst November raids said, "We were not brave because we wanted to be. We were brave because the night left us no choice." By mid-November, the blackout had transformed London into something extraordinary. A city that could vanish, a people who refused to disappear, a world wrapped in darkness, but held together by courage. And the nights were only growing colder, the raids heavier, the sacrifices deeper. But London stood firm, wrapped in darkness. Holding its breath. Waiting for dawn. By late November 1940, London had reached a point where night and danger had become inseparable. The blackout was no longer just a government order. It was a way of breathing, a way of surviving, a way of thinking. People moved through darkness with a mixture of fear and determination, as if every Londoner had become both a shadow and a soldier, without ever lifting a weapon. The weather grew colder, the fog thicker, the darkness deeper, and the raids more relentless than ever. German bombers had adopted a new strategy. Instead of short, sharp attacks, they created long, endless nights of terror, beginning at dusk and continuing until dawn, sometimes 12 hours, sometimes 14. The blackout had to hold through all of it. Each sunset was a countdown. Shops closed early, meals were eaten in a hurry, kettles boiled before curtains were drawn. Children were tucked into clothes instead of pajamas, ready to run. Fathers checked doors and bundled blankets. Mothers prepared flasks of tea and rationed snacks. Then, like clockwork, the city disappeared. A darkness so complete fell upon London that people said it felt like standing inside ink. Even the moon, when visible, felt dangerous. Many whispered, "Cloudy nights keep us safer." But cloudy nights brought their own troubles. Fog and smoke blended together until entire neighborhoods were swallowed in gray. People walked with hands along the walls, following brick textures they had memorized. A few carried pocket mirrors angled downward to catch faint glimmers from the pavement. Yet, somehow, life continued. Children still whispered stories under blankets in shelters. Men still played cards beside oil lamps, shielded under metal tins. Women still knitted socks for soldiers. Musicians still played violin softly, fighting the fear with fragile beauty. One night, in the Holborn station, a man played Abide With Me on a harmonica. 100 people went silent. Some prayed, some cried quietly, some held hands in the darkness. Above ground, the destruction grew unimaginable. Entire blocks were flattened. Churches lost their roofs. Factories burned 4 days. Streets cracked open like wounds. But always, London fought back. Fire brigades worked without rest, their boots soaked in water and ash. They climbed ladders into burning buildings, knowing the floors might collapse. They pumped hoses until their arms trembled. They jumped over craters still smoking from fresh impacts. And through all of it, The blackout hid much of the city from enemy eyes. Sometimes, after a heavy raid, dawn revealed something heartbreaking. A street still standing only because a single air raid warden had knocked on every door, ensuring every curtain was sealed. This was London's invisible army. But November brought new challenges. The bombers adapted. The fires grew hotter. The raids lasted longer. And yet, the blackout still made the difference between life and death. German pilots grew frustrated. Diaries later recovered showed entries like, "City impossible to see. No landmarks. Only darkness. We fly blind." The darkness confused them. Rivers looked like roads. Parks like bombed-out ruins. Factories like empty fields. They dropped explosives into the countryside, into marshes, into the Thames itself. Londoners, in the underground shelters, whispered, "The darkness is fighting for us now." But while the blackout protected London from the sky, it created new dangers on the ground. Ambulances struggled to reach the injured. Fire brigades collided with debris. Pedestrians fell into bomb craters they couldn't see. Even trained wardens tripped on rubble and broken rails. One survivor wrote, "The dark was as dangerous as the bombs, but without it, we would not survive." Inside homes, families lived in a strange half-world. Light came only from tightly shielded lanterns or candles hidden behind boxes. Rooms glowed faintly, like memories instead of places. People spoke softly, as though afraid the night itself could hear them. But the blackout also changed relationships. Neighbors who once barely spoke now trusted each other with their lives. Women cooked meals for elderly men living alone. Men carried children to shelters when mothers needed help. Strangers shared blankets. Strangers became family. The darkness did not divide London. It united it. Some nights, the silence before the sirens felt heavier than the raids themselves. People waited, breaths held, listening for a sound they dreaded yet expected. The low drone of engines. The trembling of glass. The distant thud of bombs falling on other districts. And then the sirens would come. Long, rising, echoing cries that sliced through the darkness. Shelters filled again. People lay shoulder to shoulder. Dust drifted when the ground shook. Children hid their faces. Mothers whispered lullabies. Men gripped pipes, walls, anything solid. Above, the night flashed orange behind clouds. The air tasted of smoke and fear. And still, everyone endured. At times, the raids grew so intense that wardens couldn't even leave the shelters. They stood in doorways instead, watching fire spread and buildings collapse through slits in the door. They waited until the worst passed, then rushed out into devastation without hesitation. These were the bravest of the brave. But perhaps the most remarkable part of late November was how ordinary people refused to surrender their humanity. A butcher shared food with families who had lost everything. Teacher turned shelter time into improvised lessons. Woman tore her coat into strips to bandage. Strangers, a priest walked shelter to shelter, praying with those who asked. A group of teenagers carried an elderly woman 3 streets to safety. And every morning, after the all clear, the same scene unfolded across the city. People swept the rubble in front of their houses. They checked on neighbors. They cooked what little breakfast they could. They went to work. They carried on. This quiet determination spread across the world and became known as the spirit of London. And the blackout, ironically, became one of its strongest symbols. It taught people to trust each other. To protect each other. To survive together. To stand united in the face of unimaginable fear. By late November, London had faced hundreds of hours of bombing. The city was scarred, but unbroken. The nights were dark, but hope still glowed in small, stubborn ways. But the worst night of the Blitz was still ahead, a night so destructive that historians would mark it as a turning point. The night of December 29, 1940. The Second Great Fire of London. But before the city faced that inferno, it had to survive the last nights of November. Nights colder, darker, and more dangerous than any that came before, and still, London walked into them with courage. The final days of November 1940 arrived with a cold so sharp it felt like it carved through clothing and bone. Londoners wrapped scarves twice around their necks, pulled heavy coats tight, and walked quickly through streets increasingly unfamiliar in the long blackout nights. Each breath became a cloud of frost. Each footstep echoed in a city that had forgotten what normal evenings felt like. The Blitz was entering one of its most violent phases. Daylight became the only safe hours. The moment the sun dipped behind the city's skyline, Londoners hurried home, erasing the night itself. Lights were killed, curtains checked twice, sometimes 3 times. More wardens patrolled than ever before. Even the slightest glow could risk an entire neighborhood. By now, the rituals were carved into muscle memory. Sharpen candles to tiny stubs. Shield them inside biscuit tins. Lay blankets at the bottom of doors. Check windows for cracks where light might escape. And when darkness finally fell, it fell like a curtain drawn by an invisible hand. Heavy, thick, and absolute. The fear of the raids, once sharp, had dulled into something quieter but deeper. People did not scream when bombs fell anymore. They simply braced, waited, held on to each other. They had become experts at surviving the unimaginable. But the nights were changing. Raids grew longer. Hours and hours of engines humming above, followed by explosions that rattled the ground like distant thunder. The Luftwaffe had increased its attacks on the docks, factories, and railways. They aimed to break London's spirit by crushing its infrastructure. Instead, London's spirit became stronger. One survivor wrote, "We didn't live through the nights. We endured them." The darkness outside created a strange contrast with the community inside the shelters. In Holborn, Aldwyr, Bethnal Green, and dozens of other stations, the platforms were packed before the sirens even started. Mothers laid out blankets. Children curled up against their fathers. Elderly neighbors sat side by side, sharing stories to distract themselves from the terror overhead. The shelters had become cities beneath the city. There were rules, unspoken but followed. Keep voices low. Share your food. Watch over the children. Help the elderly. Comfort the frightened. Sometimes, shelter leaders would walk through the crowd offering advice or news. A nurse might move from family to family, checking on babies, helping with coughs, providing medicines when she could. It wasn't comfort, but it was safety. Above ground, the reality was brutal. Incendiary bombs rained across rooftops. They hissed and popped on impact, spreading fire like angry sparks. Fire brigades fought without rest. Wardens braved collapsing walls and burning timber. Doctors worked through choking smoke in barely lit hospitals. Volunteers pulled people from rubble before the fires swallowed whole streets. And still, the blackouts held. German pilots, unable to see the ground through darkness and smoke, dropped bombs guided by instinct rather than certainty. Many fell miles from their intended targets. The city's greatest protection was its invisibility. But with each passing night, the emotional weight grew. Londoners began to lose their sense of time. Without lights, without familiar street views, without the comfort of predictable evenings, people drifted between exhaustion and shock. One woman later wrote, "Sometimes I didn't know if I was awake or dreaming the darkness." But even as fear grew, so did resilience. A story began circulating, one that helped people endure. On a night of heavy bombing, a mother and her 2 children walked into a shelter. Just moments before the ceiling of their home collapsed, she had stepped out to get a bucket of water when the siren began, grabbed her children, and ran through the street without stopping. A warden later told her, "Your timing saved you." She answered simply, "No, the darkness saved us." Stories like this spread through the city, stories of survival made possible by the blackout. But there were heartbreaking moments too. Some nights, entire families didn't make it. Some streets disappeared under rubble. Some buildings burned for days. Some people never found their loved ones again. And yet, London didn't stop. It didn't surrender. Each dawn revealed both destruction and defiance. children helping sweep glass off the pavement, neighbors carrying bricks to clear roads, women offering bread and tea to rescue workers, men digging for survivors long after the fires died down. One morning, after a particularly heavy raid, a journalist walked through a devastated neighborhood and wrote, out of the smoke. A child stepped, carrying a broom twice her size. She looked at me and said, "We must tidy up. The city needs us." I never knew courage until that moment. That was London, a city refusing to fall, refusing to fade, refusing to let the night swallow its spirit. And then came the final days of November. Days filled with a quiet tension, as if the city sensed that something worse was approaching. People whispered in shelters, "December will be harder." They say another great attack is coming. Christmas will be cold this year. They were right. The worst night of the Blitz, the night that would be called the second Great Fire of London was only weeks away. But before that night of fire, ruin, and unimaginable courage, London had to survive one more stretch of darkness. And the blackout, their oldest shield, would be tested like never before. As November slipped into December 1940, London stood on the edge of a darkness deeper than anything it had known before. The city had endured 2.5 months of nightly bombings, endless blackouts, collapsing buildings, sleepless families, and the constant hum of danger above. Yet even with its scars, London remained standing, bruised, exhausted, but unbroken. The nights had grown colder now. The frost clung to rooftops and railings. Breath hung in the air like smoke. The Thames moved slowly beneath a thin layer of fog, reflecting no lights at all, because there were none. Even Christmas lights, a tradition for centuries, were forbidden this year. For the first time in living memory, London's festive season passed in darkness. Inside homes, families tried to feel normal. Some hung simple paper decorations inside their sheltered rooms. Some baked what small rations allowed. Children asked if Father Christmas could still find them in the dark. Mothers answered softly, "He will. Light cannot find us, but love can." But outside, the world was preparing for something terrible. The raids grew heavier as December approached. The bombers came earlier in the evening and stayed longer. Londoners who once found comfort in patterns, the sound of engines approaching, the timing of sirens, realized that the attacks were becoming unpredictable. Fear returned sharper than before. One diary entry from late November read, "Every night feels like standing on the edge of a cliff." And yet, as always, the blackout held strong. Curtains remained tight. Homes stayed invisible. Streets disappeared into shadow. London became a city carved out of darkness. But December 29, 1940, the night that would be called the second Great Fire of London changed everything. In the days leading up to that night, small signs began appearing. Wardens were told to prepare for heavier raids. Fire brigades were moved closer to the city centre. Volunteers received extra equipment. Church bells were kept ready for emergency tolling. And Londoners felt it in the air. A strange stillness, a sense of waiting. But the final days before the Great Fire also showed the world something remarkable. The unbreakable unity of ordinary people. Families walked to shelters together, holding hands so tightly, their knuckles whitened. Neighbors shared food silently, placing small parcels at each other's doors. In the underground, people sang hymns, played music, whispered stories of old London, a London filled with light, laughter, and the promise of better days. Children drew pictures of the sun rising, as if to remind the city of what it was fighting for. On December 28th, the night before the worst attack, a warden wrote, "We do not fear the dark anymore. It is ours now. What we fear is what comes through it." And then came the night, December 29th, 1940. Just after 6 p.m., the first wave of bombers reached the city. They carried incendiaries, thousands of them, tiny bombs designed not to explode, but to ignite. They fell in clusters, scattering across rooftops, Like sparks from a giant, evil firework, London burst into flames. Streets lit up in orange glows that pierced the blackout. Buildings burned like torches. Churches caught fire. Warehouses exploded. The sky turned red. Smoke curled upward into the shadows. Fire brigades raced to every corner of the city, their faces lit by the inferno. Yet amid this horror, the blackout still saved lives. Because the fires were so intense, the glow could be seen from miles away. Bombers used the flames as their guide, not lights from streets or homes. The darkness still protected what had not yet ignited. But inside the city, chaos reigned. Firefighters described flames so hot that cobblestones cracked. Incendiary bombs fell at a rate so fast that men stomped them out with shovels, sandbags, anything they could find. Water hoses froze from the cold. Streets overflowed with smoke so thick that firefighters crawled on hands and knees. Still, they fought. Still, they climbed ladders into burning buildings. Still, they carried families through flame-filled corridors. Still, they shielded children with their own bodies. And above all, they protected St. Paul's Cathedral. That night, the cathedral was hit multiple times by incendiaries. If it fell, the morale of the entire city might collapse. A team of volunteer firefighters, known as the St. Paul's Watch, climbed into the burning roof beams and extinguished every bomb by hand. They fought fires in silence, smoke choking their lungs, refusing to let the building die. When dawn broke, the cathedral stood like a ghost in the smoke, blackened, wounded, but unbroken, a symbol of London itself. After the worst night of the Blitz, the city woke to devastation. Streets smoldered, buildings were gone, ash rained down like snow. Yet, through the ruins, people emerged, sweeping doorsteps, helping neighbors, hugging each other tightly, offering tea and blankets. They cried. Together. They rebuilt together. They survived. Together. And the blackout, the nightly darkness that had become part of their souls, had once again done its job. It had saved lives. It had hidden the city when light would have betrayed it. It had united millions under one purpose: survival. By the end of 1940, London had endured the unthinkable, but it still stood, a city of courage, a city of shadows, a city that used darkness not as a prison, but as a shield. And though many nights of fear still lay ahead, one truth had been carved into history. ***, no matter how long the darkness lasted, London's light could not be defeated. ***,